Okay, hello everybody. Good to see you. Welcome to, what are we at, session 6 of our new faculty orientation conversations about faith integration. So thank you for coming out today. Today our competency, we're working through a number of competencies, 8 competencies, 9 competencies, about 8 competencies. Today we're going to talk about the pedagogical competency. So we continue to get more practical in what we're trying to do here. And this in the series of competencies does flow out of the last one. Last month we talked about the methodological competency, and we talked about some of that behind the scenes preparation we do to sort of get a faith integration mindset going as we prepare and design our classes and think about possible connections. And it's the work we do as we start with experience. We talked about the quadrilateral, perhaps start with reason, working scripture and tradition into the equation. So today we're going to talk about the pedagogical competency, which, as you know, has to do with what we do in the classroom as teachers. We're defining this as the ability to develop a variety of course-relevant strategies that are impactful and sensitive to particular student populations and are effective in achieving faith integration student learning outcomes. So we don't just want to be random about this and throw it out and hope it sticks, but we want to be thoughtful and intentional about it. And we want to think about our students. So undergrads and adult students may need to experience faith integration differently. A class in theater and a class in psychology are going to need to experience faith integration differently because the students there are expecting to achieve different things with us in terms of outcomes. So I'd like you to talk to each other a little bit first as we get started about some of your favorite teaching strategies. Some of the things that you find yourself doing in your classes, some of the activities or ways you design learning so that students get it in some ways that you hope that'll happen. Why do you use or prefer these strategies? And how well do they work? Are they accomplishing what you hope they'll accomplish? How do you know that they're working? Sometimes we set things up and we're happy about it, but we're not necessarily sure it's accomplishing its aims. How do you know? So if you could sit around your tables for a few minutes, I'll give you about 6 minutes to just share some ideas with each other from your own experience, and then we'll come back together, okay? Let me interrupt you and continue with you from here. I want you to keep some of these things in mind because we're going to revisit them in some different ways as we go. But what I want to do now is I want to give you one sample of what a faith integration learning experience might look like. Now, I have to give the disclaimer that this is certainly just one sample. It comes out of me. I was asked to do a presentation for the School of Education on their opening day, so I picked something from the school and the field of education. It may not be what connects with you. And as you're going to hear me say, in our different disciplines, I think this works out in all kinds of different ways. So this isn't the way to do it. This is a way to do it. And I hope what it demonstrates for you is some principles that do emerge out of faith integration kinds of choices in our classroom. So I'm going to ask you after this is finished what observations you might have had related to this. The other disclaimer I'll give is that in the real world, I might take a significantly longer amount of time to do this than the few minutes that I'll do for you during this presentation. So welcome back from your dinner break. You've been out this evening having dinner with each other. We are in Educational Foundations and Classroom Management. We're in week 4. Hope you've been having a good time with the reading that we've been doing together. One of the things that I want to visit tonight as we continue in class, picking up on the conversation we're having about learning strategies, is this idea of cooperative learning. And cooperative learning has been around for a long time. You'll remember some of the leading thinkers in the field of cooperative learning, Jerome Kagan, Aronson, Slavin. And you read an article by Slavin this week, and I'm going to introduce to you the Johnsons, the Johnson brothers, and actually they've got a sister in the mix too, and they become an important part of the discussion of cooperative learning. But this last week, I asked you to read this article from Robert Slavin. It's a bit dated now, but as a practice in education, cooperative learning is one of those that has had staying power. A lot of educational theories and practices come and go, but cooperative learning actually has been around for a while, and the research suggests that this thing has validity to it. So I wanted you to look back into some of the history of our work in classroom management and learning theory and learning practices. This is an important one. So you read this article this week. You saw some of the things that Slavin said that make cooperative learning work as an effective learning strategy. He sums up his ideas saying, cooperative learning methods share the idea that students work together to learn and are responsible for one another's learning as well as their own. So that's sort of a summary of that idea that you saw in your reading. I won't belabor that, but you saw that there. And this gets at an idea that is actually quite historic, right? It goes back a lot farther than just a few people in the later part of the last century saying that cooperative learning is a good idea. The Greeks were interested in how people work together as citizens in the polis, in the city. And so all the way back with Socrates and the Republic, people are interested in how people cooperate with one another. The Jewish community has this idea of habaruth, which has to do with the sense of community, the sense of people working in tandem with each other. In the Gentile world, there were guilds, people who associated with themselves in order to accomplish mutual objectives in fields that they had identified as areas of commitment. In the Christian community, we have an idea as well that's supportive of this. And you may hear it from time to time in the church, if you attend church, this idea of fellowship. Fellowship. Now, I grew up in a church where we had a fellowship hall, and we went down and had punch and cookies. And I didn't really get the idea of fellowship as a very powerful idea within the gathering of Christian believers until later on, when I began to understand the depth of this idea in the idea, the word koinonia. That's the Greek word in the Christian New Testament for fellowship. And fellowship, or koinonia, we might define as having something in common with someone or a mutual participation. So if you were to study the letters of Paul, for example, the Apostle Paul, he has a lot to say about this. And he talks about koinonia, and he talks about people serving and working with one another. But I think about this idea of sharing and sharing in common, and how, that's so important in the classrooms with the kids that we'll be teaching, that you'll be teaching as educators someday. And learning to do that well is sort of a meta skill, right? In addition to how it works itself out in the classroom and aids learning, it's also a way to develop character in the students that we'll be working with. In the idea of fellowship or koinonia, we can sum it up as having a share in and giving a share in. So we might say that people in koinonia or in fellowship or cooperative relationships with each other are partners, and they are participating. So there's both the sense that I'm a part of something, I'm in connection with something, and I'm making a contribution as well. I belong, but I'm also serving to bless those that I'm in relationship with. So it's this great idea, and I think when we bring that into conversation with the idea of cooperative learning, we can get some rich insight. One of the things that young teachers sometimes don't understand is that there's actually a well-established science to putting people in groups. You'll see from the picture that this teacher hasn't learned that science. So just saying get in groups and figure it out and do the project often doesn't accomplish the objectives that a teacher may have in mind. The Johnson brothers, there they are, grew up in a home where cooperation was a big deal. In the dedication of their book, Circles of Learning, they say that this book is dedicated to our parents, Roger and Francis, who discouraged inappropriate competition and taught us to cooperate. I'd love to know the background, the faith tradition even of these guys. I don't know that. But they took some time to think about what the elements of cooperative learning might be. They noticed that it involved positive interdependence, promotive face-to-face interaction, individual accountability, social skills, and group processing. So for a few minutes today, I just want to highlight, as we introduce an assignment that I'm going to ask you to do, the social skills side of it. So anytime that you might, as a teacher, want your students in cooperative groups to understand the kinds of things that will make that work, you want to do a number of things. You want to give them some conceptual understanding of what it is you're asking them to do. So explain it, spell it out, make sense of it. Then you're going to want to help them understand what they need to do to make that skill a reality in their experience. Part of that, I would suggest, is to model the skill before them, or to get them to do an experience with one another in an artificial way as they prepare then to go into their cooperative groups. Give them an opportunity to practice it through doing it, through then getting feedback from you or from one another, and reflecting on that feedback and doing it again. This is common sense. This is how people learn. But this is also what the Johnsons have noticed make for good social skill learning in a classroom. What do I mean by social skills? Well, in a group, students are going to need to know how to confront each other constructively. Because what if somebody's not doing their job? What if some student was supposed to bring an assignment and they didn't, and that messes everybody up? Well, they need to learn to make confrontation work in their group in constructive ways. Or they need to address non-contributors with grace. And you know that even adults struggle with this, much less kids knowing how to look at one of their peers face to face and challenge them in a way that doesn't demean them or put them down. So here's what I'm going to ask you to do as a kind of capitalizing on this. In the New Testament, there are a list of one another's. And I'm going to give you, before you leave tonight, a handout with a list of about 25 one another statements, like serve one another, exhort one another, encourage one another, honor one another, admonish one another. These are all skills that we can learn and that are a part of koinonia, but can be a part of community life as well. The Apostle Paul writes to the Romans, "And concerning you, my brethren, I myself also am convinced that you yourselves are full of goodness, filled with knowledge, and you're able to admonish one another." He was convinced that they could do this as they gathered with one another. So I want you to take that list that I'm going to give you and pick one. And if your faith tradition is not a Christian tradition and this just doesn't feel comfortable to you, pick something like this. You can do a literature search and find another skill that you think is valuable. I want to invite some of you who would find it valuable to work with the one another's from the New Testament, to draw from that list and develop a skill training for that. Follow those steps that I gave you earlier, and then write that up, and then we'll practice that with each other next week. If you're interested in this, and this is just a by the way, a few years ago, because I recognized that cooperative learning had a great set of principles and insights that I thought would be valuable for small groups in the local church. So I wrote an article in the Christian Education Journal called Cooperative Learning in Christian Community. That's not so much for the public schools that you're being prepared to serve in, but for the local church and how they can benefit as well from the things in this particular field. Okay, let me shift and let's talk about the reality of our role as teachers. And I look around the room and I think, you guys get this, and I think that it's nice that the people APU hires, for the most part, do get this. But so this is a reminder to you. Your profession is your field. You think of it as your area of expertise, but your meta-profession is, of course, that you're a teacher. And figuring out how to get from the things from your head and your experience and your life and your background and your knowledge into the heads, into the minds, into the lives of our students, that's the great challenge. What are the ways to do that meaningfully? And so it's easy to default to things like lecture, because a lecture can control it. You can put it all on paper, you can read your lecture, and it is what you want it to be. Whether they learned it or not, it feels like you're in control. But of course you know that as professional educators, we want to add to our skills in this way. Here's 3 books that I found helpful along these lines. I know you're getting some of this in other places, so I'll just reinforce this here. I encourage you to read or at least even skim, just to recognize what's there once a year, a good teaching book. In addition to the things that you need to read for your work, I have found these 3 to be very helpful in stimulating my thinking about good teaching. The Skillful Teacher by Stephen Brookfield, I read in its first edition, and now what is it? It's in its 3rd edition. Really, really great stuff. Very practical, very helpful, very clear, as are these others as well. So that's something to just reinforce for us here. The other thing is, I may have alluded to this with you in the past, but I wanted to highlight it here, this idea of signature pedagogies. Who's familiar with this term, signature pedagogies? Anybody in the room? Okay, so this is a really powerful thing. It comes from Lee Shulman. Lee Shulman is the past president of the Carnegie Foundation, and he noticed, I think very perceptively, that people teach in a way that's consistent with their disciplinary habits of mind and their disciplinary ways of thinking and ways of passing on information. So if you're in healthcare, or if you're in philosophy, or if you're in art or English or psychology, these are all different ways that you've been socialized and brought into the discipline. The people who taught you guided you in certain ways. And now what we get to do is invite our students into that. And we sort of unconsciously do that as we do our thing. And some of the things I bet that you talked about earlier when I asked you to talk about ways that you might teach that might be typical to you or comfortable to you may come out of what you inherited from those who trained you. And so we want to affirm that in faith integration, and we want to recognize that there may be opportunities there that we can capitalize on. Do psychologists teach in ways to make their students more likely to think like psychologists? Does the English professor teach your students to read literary text as literary scholars do? Does the physicist employ strategies to ensure her students understand the world as physicists do? So this is what maybe subjectively or I should say unconsciously happens. We're interested in saying, how can we be more conscious of this? So here's a mind map that was done in the field of entrepreneurial art. So the question was, how does an innovative, creative artist think? And so they started in the middle with a few ideas that they drew from Howard Gardner about the different kinds of minds, and eventually what they ended up with is signature pedagogies in entrepreneurial art would include mentorship, collaborative project, and experiential learning. Those are the things that are common to being in a learning environment where you're going to learn that kind of thing. Clinical teaching is, of course, a part of nursing, right? You can't learn as a nurse, or ultimately nurses are not going to learn what they need to unless there's some clinical experience for them, where they're out there facing the realities of life in the hospital, and where then they get a chance to come back around a seasoned professor, an instructor, a clinical guide who can do debriefing with them and have conversations with them about what happened out there. That's going to be unique and important in the field of nursing. So I've got 4 pictures up here. See if you can, I'll give you 38 seconds to identify what might be happening in these pictures, what fields might be represented by the pictures that you see in terms of learning experience. So what kind of class might be represented by the assignment in the top left there? An English class, a writing class, right? This is a part of learning to be a writer, is to get people involved in the craft of writing. So that's actually a studio, an art studio, right? So you're not going to learn much art unless you get together and make stuff. Physical education, of course, you better be doing the work out there, learning how to stretch, etc. And so the easiest one to get our minds around this is what is going on up there. The Socratic method, right? The questions and the more questions and the still more questions that Socrates learned to ask in order to get his students to come to the truth. So philosophy, you wouldn't be experiencing what you need to in a philosophy program unless you were getting some Socratic method, right? So I would like to ask you then to talk about what might you identify as a signature pedagogy in your discipline. And as you think about this, can you imagine it offering you any unique ways to approach faith integration in your classroom? So you may right off know what some of those might be. It might take some brain working. If you don't have an answer to the second question, that's fine. I want to get you thinking about it. But what are some of those things that for your field might be the way that students come to have knowledge? Talk about that for a few minutes. Okay, let me have you back for a little while here before we finish up for today. So I want you to get in mind the different strategies that you talked about earlier and the kind of strategies that you heard from each other. I think we'll not do this, but I was going to have you maybe have conversation about other ideas. I'll just put a bunch of them up there just to get you thinking about them. Of course, we've got lectures and we assign readings, service learning, debates, creating posters, developing a dramatic presentation, responding to a film, case studies, etc. So some of those you may say, that just would not work in my area. Good, right? Others you say, well, that's intriguing. I wonder if that could be useful to me as a pedagogical strategy. My interest now is making faith integration connections. And so I'm going to give you 5 or 6 ideas from amongst these hopefully just to spur you to then think about how this might work in your context. And again, I won't be able to do justice to what's here. This is a way to throw things out to you and then to encourage you to consider them for yourselves. The first one, I'll just put this picture up there. This was what we talked about in our last session, the Wesleyan Quadrilateral. I've talked to a number of faculty who take this and over the course of a semester design an assignment with their students where they get to do all of this together around an idea. Many will start with an experience that's relevant to the discipline and spell it out for students, ask students to go study that experience, to go look at real observations in that area, and to get a sense of what it's about. And when they come back and kind of have that in their mind, then they can introduce some literature from the discipline, some reason. They can introduce some literature from the Christian faith, maybe from tradition and or scripture, and they can begin to get students to see how all these things can come into conversation with each other. So I'll just put that one out as follow-up of last time and commend it. It's probably not a 1 week, 5-minute kind of activity, right? This is one that could carry itself out in a number of ways. Okay, let me give you a few others. Let's talk about service learning. So how many of you have had a chance to do a service learning project in your classes yet? Anybody? It's often not something people do in their first year. That's of course, makes sense as you get used to things. But service learning, we have a great group here, the Center for Academic Service Learning and Research. You should know that they would love to hang out with you and help you design a service learning experience around your course. And I highly recommend you do that. The question that we get to is, okay, assuming that the service learning experience relates to your course and your course outcomes, that's a given. That needs to happen. Otherwise, it's not going to accomplish what you need it to accomplish. The next question is, are there any faith integration opportunities that can also tie in here so that the service learning is not simply Christian because we served, because service learning is all over the place. It's not merely a Christian idea, but it ties in some unique ways to the Christian faith. Let me give you just an idea on this, okay? So let's say it's a class on reading and writing. And the service learning project is to support local kids who are learning to read. So here in one of our surrounding communities, there might be a way to connect with libraries or with schools in order to support that work. So you know that literacy has been used in Christian mission. People have used learning to read as a way to invite people to understand how to read the Bible and the gospel. But you don't want to assume that just because that's been done that that's necessarily worthy or that it could be maybe done in a more ethical way. So you want to also ask students to read some articles. You've given them a reader and to write a reflective essay articulating their view of the ethics involved in a Christian use of literacy education as part of missionary strategy. Include reflections on your experience with students in the city of Azusa. So they've been encountering real people. Christians have used learning to read historically as a way to open the doors for the gospel. And yet certain contexts, here's a book out of India. Here's an article called Literacy and Conversion in the Discourse of Hindu Nationalism that doesn't smile too proudly on the idea of using literacy in missionary efforts. Well, if you invite your students to bring their experience with real students out there and the things that they're learning about literacy and learning to read in class with that kind of conversation, it could reveal some helpful things for them in understanding how to approach a Christian objective such as mission in an ethical way. This one's from Michael back there. Wouldn't it be interesting to ask students after reading Flannery O'Connor if she is writing Christian fiction? See, I knew he'd have an answer, right? He's shaking his head vigorously back there. No, she's not. But somebody might argue yes. And it might be interesting to invite students to take two sides to a particular debate about whether this Christian author is writing Christian fiction. What is she aiming to do? And not that some students get the right answer and some students get the wrong answer, but it gives them a chance to explore some literature that might actually deepen their thinking about an issue beyond just a yes, no, easy answer because the professor's got it, right? So there's another idea for you. What's that? Right. In the end, you can give them the right answers. Here's another example of discussion. So here your class, like the example I gave earlier, is on something like classroom management. You're teaching people who are going to go into elementary schools, and they need to read this book because it has lots of ideas on how to manage the class. But one of the sort of issues that doesn't get addressed as much as I've skimmed books like this and did a literature search on ideas like this is the issue of authority. So in these days, the question of the teacher's authority is an interesting question, because should the teacher go in and be the friend of the students? Should the teacher go in and be really harsh and kind of intense with the students? What is the nature of authority in the public school classroom? Well, here's a guy, he's a Christian educator who's thought about that, mostly thought about that in the context of the church. But a Christian teacher might say, you know what, we can perhaps draw some insights out of a Christian educator who's been interested in the question of authority. Maybe what we have students do is divide up into groups, and in their groups they can divide up the readings in this book. It has 5 or 6 chapters. We divide it up amongst ourselves. And then on a certain date, we're going to have a round-robin discussion on the question of Christian authority in the secular classroom. And so the discussions might start where everybody who has chapter 1 gets together, everybody who has chapter 2 get together, chapter 3 get together. They share their ideas and, yeah, I didn't think of that. That's a great idea, or I thought that too. And then they go back to their original groups and they develop a more full perspective on what that might look like to be a Christian who has authority and how that works out in a secular kind of context. Now you'll notice an example like this doesn't involve a graded assignment. It requires people to be supportive and accountable to one another in groups, like that cooperative group idea. But what it suggests is that the learning is going to be self-generated rather than built upon you're going to get a certain amount of points for doing this. Maybe you give them points for participation, for preparation. But some faith integration assignments, I think, should not be graded because it'll ruin them. Some should be, and there are examples here of that as well, but we need to make that a careful choice. So sometimes experience is a great learning opportunity, right? So I taught a class in the Global Studies Department on sustainable societies. And this movie wasn't out at the time, but I might have used this movie in my class, Growing Cities, a film about urban farming in America. I did have my students then volunteer for a half a day on an urban farm. I gave them places that they could go, gardens that they could work at, farmers that they could meet, get their gloves on, get dirty, get out there and work in the garden, work on the farm for a while. So then I might have them read an article out of a book that puts the question of agriculture and Christianity into conversation, a book by a Nigerian called The Worship of God Through Agriculture. And I might give the students the assignment to create a PowerPoint with no more than 5 photographs. I want a photograph PowerPoint, not a word PowerPoint. I want pictures in which they illustrate how working the land did or could support their spirituality and connection with God. Get out there and do something in the real world and be reflective of that. And then read this article, which will get you thinking about connecting with God and how agriculture can be supportive of that. And then tell us your story. You get 5 slides. Tell us your story. Here's a group project in a class on media ethics. So in groups of 4, each person will be given a handout overviewing one Christian faith tradition. So last week, part of what we did when we talked about the quadrilateral is affirm the perspectives and value that can come out of looking at things from the perspective of different Christian faith traditions. Here's just 4 of them. They'll be given one of those, and they become sort of take on that identity. They begin to understand and personify that, and then they individually find 2 articles that deal with the pros and cons of social media. So we've taught them to use databases in the library so that they can go find such things. Using the handout on the faith tradition, the Christian faith tradition, and other materials that you may find, prepare to share with your group your critical assessment of the readings based on your faith tradition. So I'm going to talk about social media from the perspective of the Reformed tradition. Person sitting next to me is going to talk about it from the perspective of the Pentecostal tradition. And around the circle, what insights does that tradition give as you read that article? And then we'll ask them as a group to pick the 4 best articles. So they've got 8, pick the 4 best, and write a 1 to 2 page response to each one based on the 4 traditions. So now that they get, over the course of the semester, they get to read these 4, they get to look at all 4 through the tradition, and then we'll ask them to organize their articles and responses into a reader that they can distribute to the rest of the class. That way what the class has is now, depending on the size of the class, a nice little packet of articles on social media and some different ways to view it from different Christian faith perspectives. And of course, something like that could be easily graded as we look at how they attempted to do that kind of work. Okay, I'm going to call this low-key research instead of, intense research that might show up in some of your classes, maybe in 300 or 400 classes. And let's talk about biology. So we'll ask the students to search the web for blogs dealing with the question of Christians as scientists, which, as you probably know, is a question that scientists ask. How can we be scientists who study the real world, the natural world, and we study it in as objective ways as we possibly can, and be Christian? How do those fit together? And that's a conversation. Identify at least 4 blogs that seem to offer input with some substance or depth. On 4.7, we're going to bring 2 pages of notes, ideas, insights from our blogs. And out of each blog, develop 1 question. And this will be submitted as a part of their grade. So I'm going to hold them accountable. They're going to say the kinds of things that they want to say, so I'm not going to do too much micromanaging, but I'm going to make sure they were thoughtful and that they did what they were asked to do. And then I'm going to tell them that on this particular date, we're going to have a biologist come, and she's a Christian biologist, and she's going to discuss how she approaches her task as a biologist from within her Christian convictions. After she shares, she'll take your questions. So students have been looking at these blogs, thinking about questions, and then they can bring those to our guests. And then later on in the semester, a week later actually, they're asked to submit a 2-page essay offering their current views on how the matter of being a Christian and being a scientist come together for them. We can call it a tentative perspective. They're going to grow in that over the course of our time together, during the time that they're at the university, perhaps in their graduate school, and encourage them to be intentional about beginning to think about that particular question. If you wanted to go further on this, you could ask them to pick a known Christian scientist from history. You could give them a list of such people, and they could add that into their thinking too. They could study some of these folks and wonder how they approached it from a Christian perspective. Okay, so let me stop here and ask you to talk to each other for a few minutes. I want to finish before you go with a few principles related to design. But what might this have triggered for you? Something entirely different, something that builds off one of the examples I've seen, something that you're already doing that just it confirms for you that you're on the right track. Talk to each other for about 7 minutes about some of the kinds of things that this made connections for in your world. In our final minutes, let me give you some principles that may be helpful to you related to sort of going at this and designing pedagogical strategies and activities. So first is, common sense. Be clear on your integrative aim. What is it that you hope will be accomplished? What would you like students to come away with? And maybe they come away with more questions. Maybe they come away with enough dissatisfaction with as much as they've done that they want to go further in their thinking. In 101 and 201 classes, it can be valuable to have as your aim to prepare them for 301 and the classes and conversations that they'll have later on. And if your department is having those kinds of internal conversations, that can be very, very valuable. Do you want them to make innovative connections? Do you want them to see things along with you that maybe haven't been seen before, or at least haven't been seen by them? There might be somebody out there, there probably is, some Christian scholar who's made some connections before, but how can you help them begin to do that? How can you help them to recognize God's truth as it may already be within an area that you're interested in them learning about? Maybe you want them to meet individuals who have lived out these things and have reflected on their faith. Maybe you want them to appreciate some of the people who've gone before you and before them in making these kinds of connections. So their introduction to integrative pioneers. So be clear for yourself what you want. And sometimes you'll, like any teaching kind of thing, you'll want to tell them ahead. In the end, this is what I hope will happen. Sometimes you won't say that because you want it to unfold in more organic ways. I would also encourage you to not give assignments that you at least couldn't do yourself. I want to say that you haven't done yourself. I understand that's not always realistic. But I know as I listen to people, faculty members talk about faith integration, sometimes I'm like, wow, you have students do that? And they're like, well, yeah, it's really hard for them. And I want to ask the next question. Could you do it? Have you done it? And I understand that we don't do every assignment we ask our students to do. That's not always realistic. But make sure it's doable is the point. I think there are some places where the bar has been put so high that it might be a challenge for a faculty member to do it. So make sure that it is doable. Remember that students, by definition, need at least some scaffolding for you. So that we recognize they're here and we're here in their knowledge. It's not a human hierarchy, but in their knowledge means we have to create some ways to help them to build that and some handles. That might mean that this week you demonstrate for them a part of what you want them to do in the final assignment. And maybe you demonstrate it again. Maybe you give a handout that talks about some steps that can be taken. You might give room for flexibility within that set of steps. But students really need that kind of thing, and I think it's wrong for us just to give them an assignment and assume that they'll figure it out. They're adults now. We have adult students who are adults now, but they still need, as learners, the scaffolding that we can provide. Include relevant and reasonable conversation partners via existing literature from your field in the Christian faith. You saw that in my demonstration, and I think in all my examples, you saw such things. It doesn't mean you have to assign a Christian book, though you may if it seems sufficient enough and worthy enough to encompass a big bit of what you want to accomplish in the class. The point is to bring people into the conversation and to get our students thinking around those people as well. And then, obviously, think how long this is going to take. Talk about how Plato and Jesus wanted to change the world. Do that in 5 minutes and, I'll call you back together. Probably not reasonable, right? So be reasonable when you ask people to talk in small groups for what they can accomplish in that. Be reasonable what might take a half a semester or a whole semester, and think that through in some careful ways. So I hope that helps you. I hope you will continue to think about some ideas related to signature pedagogies or generic kinds of things that you might try. The fun thing about being new at the university is you have some time to experiment and to see what might work and then to revisit it and to improve it over time. Part of what I hope you'll do in this as well is you'll collect your reflections on this in your portfolio that I've encouraged you to put together on your computer. A place on your computer, a folder where you're gathering things that are working, articles you're using. You might have an article in there, you tried it once, put a big X through it because that article didn't work, or rather than give them the whole article, you might give them an excerpt from it, but you've got a portfolio being developed as a place to gather these things together. So I hope learning about the pedagogical competency has been helpful to you today. Appreciate you being here, and we'll look forward to being together next time. Thanks.